Anyway, I'm Robert Cartwright. I'm Vice Chairman of the Institute of Classical Osteopathy. And this evening, we're really lucky to have Chris Campbell joining us here to talk about and answer your questions on spinal and body mechanics. This is a great opportunity to hear Chris talk, as he is arguably one of the world's leading experts on this subject. And also, in addition to this, probably the world's leading expert on John Martin Littlejohn, both of which he's written and published books about. I believe he's just about to publish a new book on Littlejohn, which might be worth asking him a question about in the question and answer session. And Chris also has, is one of these people who has the great ability to be able to explain complex subjects simply. But additionally, before I hand you over to Chris and Ben Adams, who works with Chris and is going to just help through the question and answer session. Ben is also a fantastic osteopath in his own right. But I'd like to tell you some exciting news about our postgraduate education program that we do at the Institute of Classical Osteopathy. For some years now, we've been trying to help people become better osteopaths by running what we call the pathway, which is the foundation, the applied and the advanced courses. But during this rather unusual hiatus in normal life, the lockdown period, we've kind of had the opportunity to reflect about how we teach classical osteopathy, and have decided that we're not going to run these 3 courses anymore, but we're going to integrate the 3 courses over a 2-year period, and it's now going to be called the Postgraduate Diploma in Classical Osteopathy. And this merges all of our courses together to make sure we can turn out really competent classical osteopaths at the end of 2 years. And this has been a really exciting time helping the Institute team develop this, and we're going to start running this course in the early part of the new year. So if you'd like any further information about the Postgraduate Diploma in Classical Osteopathy, please keep an eye on our website, which is www.classical-osteopathy.org, as we'll be publishing further details about the course as and when we're ready to do so, or email us for further details about enrolling on it. But now I'd like to hand you over to Chris Campbell. Thank you very much. Hello, Chris.
Oh, thank you, Rob. Yes, it's my first time doing something like this, so please bear with me. I decided when I tried to do it first that, is everybody gone? No. That I would not try to do it live, that it was best to try and do a short video, do a little introduction, and then to discuss it afterwards. And the whole idea is to get across the basis of body mechanics. And we have to remember that Still was a mechanic. He approached illness from the point of view of mechanics. Simple mechanics and straightforward mechanics. But that didn't mean that it was simplistic. He never took a simplistic view that there was a bone out of place and he pushed it back into place. He took the view of the grand architect. And if you think of the word architect and a building or construction, it takes in the whole plan of the construction, every aspect of it. And that's what he wanted to turn out. Master architects and engineers who could service the body. So I'm just going to ask you to have a look at this video. It's about 30 minutes long. Hopefully you'll find some questions in it, some answers in it, and we'll discuss it afterwards. Okay, so if...
Introduction to spinal and body mechanics. If we think of the osteopathic, sometimes we think of just simply a bone out of place that has to be put back in, a specific adjustment that has to be done. We have to remember that the osteopathic lesion is not a bone out of place. Sometimes our patients talk about their disc having slipped out and want us to put it back in. Again, to remember that the osteopathic lesion is not a slipped disc. It's not something out of place which can be put back into place. It's all about mechanics. The human body is subject to the same mechanical laws as a bicycle or a building. We all live in this field of gravity. So if you have a bicycle that has got a fault, it'll work inefficiently, make the driver work harder to get it to go anywhere. It will eventually break down. The same will happen with a building. If a building's base isn't level, it'll develop cracks and perhaps it will eventually fall down as well. But there is a difference with the human body. The human body, by contrast, will compensate for strains or maladjustments and may continue to work without giving any obvious symptoms. So how does the body compensate? And the key to understanding this is in understanding the body architecture. I still would say, the more we know of the architecture of God, the God of nature, and the closer we follow it, the better will we be pleased with the results of our work. The key to understanding is in body and architecture. The osteopathic lesion we use is sort of a generic term for any type of injury, however slight or serious, which interferes with the normal functioning of the body. Left untreated, it may lead to adverse effects on organs or tissues and disease, and it may be simply a maintaining factor in disease or precursor of disease or contributing factor of disease, but it is an important aspect in the production of disease within the patient. What does Wernham say about osteopathic lesion?
Simple, isn't it? Osteopathy is very simple in principle. Hell to practice. God. All the times. Typical structural pattern, and you have typical physiological patterns, and with this you must learn. Osteopathy is not manipulation. Much more than that.
He puts it into context of typical patterns, whether they are structural, mechanical, or physiological, and that these are based on what Littlejohn would call physiological physics. There's no pure mechanics in the body. The body will adapt, and will adapt by physiological changes. The importance that Littlejohn put on this, we can see from a time when he had people into the BSO writing an article on it. When photographs were being taken, one of the key things that he did was to have the mechanical structure that he taught of Henry's lines and pyramids on the board at the time. Pyramids, stress lines, and arch systems all lead us into a treatment approach using body architecture and the body adjustment as a routine. These lines, whether they're the PA line or the line of cavity pressures within the body, or the line of articulation within the body, or the pyramids that we get from the baseline up to the base of the skull, the baseline being based on the primitive baseline between the greater trochanters representing the cerebrospinal nervous force within the body, and the lines to the tip of the coccyx representing the relationship with the sympathetic system within the body. They're not just mechanical lines, they have a physiological context as well. The same with the arch functions, whether it is the functional arches, or what we call the central arch, or the powerhouse within the spine, or the physiological arches, or the structural arches. They all have a relationship between the mechanics of the body and the physiology of the body, the gateway through which we enter the physiology within the body. That body architecture, we can divide it up, as I said, into a number of different aspects. There's the cavity pressures, the articulatory spinal mechanism, the arch systems, the cerebrospinal sympathetic nervous system, the vasomotor system, etc. But before we get into that, let's look at just some history, because these lines didn't just appear. Littlejohn didn't just make them up. Wernham didn't make them up and draw them on the board. They came from, initially, a gentleman called Clifford Elmore Henry. They were called Henry's lines and pyramids. But before Henry, still we talk about the pyramids within the spine. Pyramids of Gerrish, which are based on the shapes of the vertebral bodies within the spine. Gerrish wrote the anatomy equivalent, American equivalent of Gray's Anatomy. Henry was the son of a drugstore owner in Kirksville. He studied osteopathy and worked in the Northern Institute of Osteopathy. And when we find the osteopathic physical diagnostic charts of Smith's in the October 1900 Journal of the Science of Osteopathy, we find the first mention that I found of Henry's lines. That the lines and triangles of Dr. C.E. Henry illustrate the mechanical and scientific basis of osteopathy. So why do we have so many arches and lines? We start with, we've got all these stress lines, the pyramids, we've got the arches, and we've got the central arch, which we mentioned, the structural arches, the physiological arches, the inter-arch pivots, the AP line, the PA line, etc. Why do we have so many, and how does it relate to lesions? And how is it of benefit to the modern osteopath? Well, we start from the beginning. Every body that operates within the world operates within the field of gravity, and to be balanced around a center of gravity line, whether it's the human body or any other body. And at the center of gravity line, it's more than just a reference point for movement and development. It's more than just a line around which the body is balanced. Littlejohn used to say that the law of gravitation is both a centripetal and a centrifugal force, drawing forces which draw things together and hold things apart. And within the human body, the forces which balance it, whether they're chemical or physical or whatever, they have their homologues in the field of biology. And the simplest living substance has an internal force which keeps all its particles determined to that organism. Within the human body is no different. We have that force, the general force which we call the vital force within the body, whose function it is to give that balance within the body. But if we go back a little bit further into the development of the body, we know that the body develops around what we call the notochord. That is, that gives us this axis around which the body is determined, embryological folding is determined, and the regulation of ectoderm and mesoderm differentiation happens. But even before that, at a deeper level, if we go back to the cellular division, no cell can divide without having a midline. First of all, creating a midline around which it is going to divide. This idea of a midline within the body is the same general concept as the center of gravity line. And we can divide the forces which balance that within the body into two great fields, the field of articulation and the field of cavity pressures. And at a very gross level within the breathing system within the body, we have that rhythmic interplay between inhalation and exhalation. In inhalation, the support to the spine comes more from the cavity pressures. In expiration, that then shifts back to the line of articulation within the spine. That's at a gross level. If we go down through all the different systems within the body, we get that same rhythmic play between the forces which balance around the center of gravity line or the midline. In this diagram drawn by Hall from lectures given by Littlejohn, we see balance around the center of gravity line in the middle. On one side, we get imbalance where both the cavity pressures and the line of articulation are overworking. And on the other side, where both cavity pressures and the line of articulation are failing to give the proper support. And that they lead to particular types of problems. On the one side, spastic diaphragm, pressure on the abdominal walls, weak abdominal muscles, pressure on the inguinal ligament, etc. Femoral hernia, inguinal hernia, and deflection, etc. On the other side, you get prolapse diaphragm, tension of the abdominal walls, pressure on the abdominal organs, rectal prolapse, constipation, hemorrhoids. So these changes can be related to mechanical structures, to the physiological endpoint or disease processes that the patient has. And this is the important point, that we can follow that pathway from the mechanical to the mechanical physiological, to the physiological to the disease process. And remember, these cavities aren't just the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, but we also have the mediastinum and the division in that cavity. We also have the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. We also have the cavity within all the fascial compartments within the body. And moving forward to the understanding of what this osteopathic treatment is, the principle of osteopathic treatment. Littlejohn tried to get over this idea that people had, that the idea was that they laid too much stress on the idea of correction, forgetting that this wasn't the principle of osteopathy. The principle wasn't that we take something and move it back into place or give it more mobility when it is stuck. That the correction leads us to the principle, which is articulation. Yes, we do need to improve movement where movement doesn't exist, where it should exist, but that only allows us then to get into the rhythmic application of articulation within the mechanical fields of the body. And it's that rhythmic articulation which coordinates and correlates the function within the body. We mustn't forget always the physiological side of Head's law, Hilton's law, which gives us those great methods of understanding how the body physiology is talking to us on the surface and how our treatment on the surface goes deep within the body. But we're talking about forces, we're talking about gravitational forces and correcting and balancing those forces. But as Wernham used to say, we must never, ever introduce force or force away through obstruction. Simply apply rhythmic movement, rhythmic articulation. The correction is always a crude intervention into the body. We never introduce force into rhythm, nor let the patient introduce force. It's always rhythmic articulation, and that articulation, to understand how to do it properly, we must have a deep understanding of the anatomy and the physiology. For example, underneath the clavicle, we've got the great vessels, we've got the ansa subclavius, we've got the vagus nerve, we've got all the attachments of the splenius muscles and so on. We must understand all of that relationship and the general reflexes, the viscerefferent reflexes, the sympathetic reflexes, and so on within the spine. We must understand what's underneath our fingers when we're articulating. And the key to understanding that is in the body architecture. Still put it beautifully, he spent many years studying anatomy and physiology. He always insisted that physiology was part of anatomy and that we couldn't do without an understanding of physiology and anatomy and the mechanics of the body, and we operate as mechanics. He said by this extensive study, he had formed in his head a perpetual image of every articulation in the framework of the body. Not just the bony articulations, but the visceral articulations, fascial articulations, and so on and so forth. An understanding of that allowed him to develop his treatment. Littlejohn, as we said, considered these rhythmic processes, the balancing and mediating functions, and the healing processes within us. And it's that rhythmic articulation within body adjustment that liberates the healing forces within the body and allows the vital force to do the correction and the healing. But we also must involve the patient. The patient has gone through many processes, many injuries, and developed many disease-forming habits during that time. And patient involvement is important. We must teach the patient that he can control his muscular system and get voluntary control over it. This is where we come to actively passive movement in the routine of the body adjustment. It doesn't mean that we get the patient to do the movements. It doesn't mean that we put the patient to sleep and do the movements for them in a totally passive way. The patient must be actively passive. In other words, they must let the movement take place and allow change to take place. Some disease forming habits are easy to recognize, some are not. And it does take time and energy in talking to the patient and listening to the patient and leading the patient to understand how they're contributing to their own process. Going back to the mechanics again, Littlejohn said that he talked not only about the normal structural curves within the body, but he also taught that the occipital atlantal, including the skull, is also an arch. The arch extends into the skull, and also it extends down through the hips. The long bone of the thigh is an arch. The arches in the leg and the arches in the feet are also arches, and they need to be functioning. So what does Wernham have to say about this?
I spoke this morning about pattern vision. It's all been recorded in our literature, by the way, you can buy the books. You have these lateral curvatures, right way down the spine. That is an 8-week drawing. Those curvatures are, of course, the reaction to the baseline. They're not reacting to each other. You can't push that and push that. You don't have it. And so these are all reactions to the baseline. If you don't do the baseline, you won't get any joy. But the point I'm making at the moment, those lateral curvatures extend up into the cranium. So you have the whole side and the flat side of the cranial, right, and all that. So the point is, you get this, what I call the kidney shaped head. Those hours doing this, well, this simply is an extension of these lateral movements. Now, I see so many cases of this type, get all the time out and they react on its own.
When he's talking about the cranial field and the extension of the lines into the cranial field, he's not saying that we must neglect specific lesions in the cranium, but they must be seen in the context of the whole, of the relationship between the baselines and the lines of stress and coordination between the arms and the legs, and the lines of cavity pressures and articulation, and that they extend into the cranium. And to remember that the body is a whole, it operates as a unit, and to take one part of it and just to work on that on its own is going to be very limiting in what we do. And again, the risk of overemphasizing this quote from Littlejohn, I don't think it can be overemphasized. It's these rhythmic processes, whether it's the rhythmic processes within the sympathetic nervous system, the cerebrospinal nervous system, within the organ systems, within the cavities, within how we act within the world in terms of our arm and leg movements in walking and movement, how we present ourselves in posture. These rhythmic processes are the balancing and mediating functions, and they represent the healing processes. Or, if they're out of order, the disease-producing processes within us. Again, listening to Wernham.
If we draw the spine, that's simply drawing a line. That's an 8 view. Straight. On the one hand, we have this thing we call volume forces. Which are in battle. They That's over there. On the other side, we have this articulation equilibrium. Mitigate forces into time, each depending on the other. Equilibrium, let's see. The same as France. In the middle, we have these physical structures. You can't see this, you can't see this, but you can see what I'm doing. But that's what it works. So it does mean, you see, that I draw a side again. We have an input from this unstable side. Goes on this. On this side, we have this very powerful business of non-parallel forces designed by change. The non-parallel are more important. We will not be moved. We have to equate these two aspects in the body. If you don't, you're nothing more than manipulative. That is, that.
It's important to understand that when he says that these forces are implacable, that they will be obeyed, they will not be moved, he's talking about the forces of gravity and structure within the body and within the human relationship of the human frame to gravity. That cannot be ignored. And it's the balance between that and the sympathetic side, the sympathetic rhythmic interplay that we work on, that we try to restore balance within it. Always remembering the unity of the body organism. It's a unit in action and it's a unit in function. Littlejohn often referred to it as a commissariat, where each part is dependent upon and interacts with each other part. Now, if we come back to typical patterns, we take, for example, the line of articulation within the body, and we start looking for typical patterns related to a dysfunction within that. The patterns arise where the line passes in relation to or through the vertebral bodies, so that we get the points of interest being the coccyx, the lumbosacral joint, the dorsolateral area, the C6 region, and at the top, the OA region. From a mechanical point of view, we've also got then to look at that from the physiological point of view, and the relationship between the ganglion umpire, the hemorrhagic and the adrenal system of the DL, and so on, that there's a physiological as well as a mechanical relationship. It's a typical type pattern. If we go to other patterns within the arch systems, you'll find other typical patterns, structural and physiological. In the order of the day, as Wernham said in one of his wonderful lectures that he produced on what he called the 3 R's in osteopathy, and just taking the last few bits of that, he talked about the aim, the major targets that we have in osteopathic philosophy and treatment. Difficult ones to attain are the coordination, the correlation, and the stabilization of the equilibrium within the body. That's what we're aiming for. That's the end point. To put that into context, Littlejohn says that this disturbance in rhythm is the cause of the majority of diseases and the first abnormal condition to be overcome. Disturbance in rhythm means imposing rhythm, reintroducing rhythm. And that brings us back to the principle of osteopathy, articulation. Hall, who was a great student of Littlejohn, said that Littlejohn repeatedly stated that the individual lesion should never be treated as individual on its own, but should always be adjusted in relation to the adjacent structures. And it was for this purpose that he applied the long lever technique. He went on to say that if you're applying the long lever technique, it's excellent. It's a wonderful technique, provided you have to have an intimate knowledge of anatomy, which includes physiology and mechanics, and the ability to apply that leverage in the adjustment of the body. He said regarding Littlejohn again that he'd never seen any other osteopath use the upper and lower limbs as much in the correction of spinal lesions as he did with Littlejohn. And just to finish on this idea of the general treatment. General treatment fell into disrepute very early on in Kirksville. Before Littlejohn came to Kirksville, the general treatment was being taught, and it fell into disrepute. Degenerated into just waggling in, taking each articulation in the body through its own range of movement as such, without any thought for the architecture of the body or the physiological processes. Littlejohn himself, when he taught and talked about the general treatment, it would be very, very specific. You'd have a general treatment aimed at the nutritional system field within the body, general treatment aimed at the vasomotor system within the body, general treatment aimed at the general respiratory system within the body, each one being very specific in nature. Again, based on what he called physiological physics. Wernham took this well-known phrase of Littlejohn's that the problem in osteopathy is not bone adjustment but body adjustment, and changed the term general treatment to body adjustment. And again, echoing what Hall said, that this work needs skill, time, thought, energy, and artistry. And coming back again to what Littlejohn called it, knowledge of physiological physics. It's a routine that we use. We use that routine to enter this mysterious force, a mysterious world of unseen force and function. It was Littlejohn who emphasized that idea of getting way behind the visible body into that mysterious unseen world of force and function. And we use that routine to do it. Our approach, if we're looking for typical patterns, we can be looking, for example, in the anterior-posterior plane at the long ligament, spinal circulation, sensory motor relationship in the axial plane, the RTAM, the cerebrospinal nervous system, the cerebrospinal fluid, etc. The field of articulation, we've got the spinal reflexes, ligamentous sense, muscular sense, and so on. In all of those, articulation of the joints. The first cause maintaining condition of disease is found in the articulation of the joints, and it's that rhythm of the joints and how that leads us into that unseen rhythm behind it. He says that every organ, every tissue of the body is vibratory. Every articulation is supposed to be mobile. And he takes that right down to not just the gross organs like the liver and the stomach and the adrenals and so on, but down to the cellular level, down to the dendritic field within the nervous system. And coming back to this routine, why do we use a routine? We use it to enter that world of rhythm. As Wernham said, when routine has become established, we enter almost unconsciously that world of rhythm. But we establish that routine by applying ourselves with concentration, thought, and a deep understanding of anatomy, physiology, and mechanics. If routine doesn't have that concentration within it, it degenerates into engine wiping and goes nowhere. But with that understanding and that application, we enter that world of rhythm and unseen force that Littlejohn talks about. And always to remember that this correction, the individual correction, is a crude intervention. That crude intervention or adjustment allows us to enter that realm of rhythm through articulation, rhythmic articulation, which is the principle of osteopathy. Thank you.
Any questions for Chris?
Well, first of all, I'd like to apologize for the quality of the sound on some of the videos from Wernham. I think that just happens sometimes when we transfer things from one place to another. I hope it was clear enough. If it wasn't, please ask. But the whole idea is that we can't get around mechanics. We can't get out of the field of gravity. We have an internal gravity field within us, we have an external gravity field, and they must be balanced to each other. And if there is a strain, an osteopathic lesion, the forces of gravity and the stress lines and the architecture of the body is what causes that strain or that osteopathic lesion to find a balance within the body. That balance is a state of unease, which will degenerate into a state of disease. And it's the reverse of that process that we have defined in our treatment. And the whole idea of routine. Routine is a word which isn't often thought of in a positive way. Except, I mean, if you go into trying to do any rescue work of any description or something which requires a teamwork which has to act in a very specific way, they drill it in until it becomes absolute reflex and routine. We use the body adjustment to do that routine that Wernham has put together in it, so that we can concentrate on it. We know the lesion patterns. We know what the normal should feel like. Still always emphasized, before you treat the abnormal, before you go into clinic, he preferred students not to go into his clinic until they knew what normal felt like. So the abnormal would stand out, and they would be able to recognize the patterns and to treat it accordingly. So if there are any points you want to ask about or any questions, I'll try and answer them or pass them over to Ben.
Yeah, are there any questions, people?
I have a question. Hello?
Sure. Oh, yeah, go.
Do you listen to me? Yeah.
Yes.
Before talking about the approach, you mentioned the ligamentous sense and the muscle sense.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain a little bit more these 2 points, please?
The reflexes within the ligaments and within in the muscles, and particularly in around the spine. You have the stretch reflexes in the ligaments and the Golgi tendon ones in the muscles and other reflexes. It's that sense of the speed of movement of joint, the balance between joints that we have in our posture. That's what he's talking about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions at all?
Chris, could you talk a little bit more about how you re-establish rhythms?
Okay. First of all, is getting the patient to let go. You have to teach the patient to let go, that they can relax and accept the movement that you put into the treatment. That can be very difficult. Sometimes we can spend half a dozen treatments or more just trying to get past that, where the patient just goes really stiff when you try and lift a leg or an arm and try and move it. To get that cerebrospinal overdrive that they have out of the way so that you can introduce the rhythm back into the body. Another way is once you've got that, is through articulation. We had a patient this morning, a child, what age was the child? About 2 months old, severe colic, had a very difficult birth, had a force vector from the birth process, which went down diagonally through the body. A really nasty C2, C1 lesion. And you could try working on that C1, C2 lesion as long as you like, and you weren't going to get anywhere. I held on to it for about a minute, just listening to it to see what was happening. And when you start thinking of the mechanics and the force that went into the body, you know that this is going to be a buckling of the central arch. The central arch is formed before the child is born as one of the key structures in the birthing process. Too much force, it's going to buckle. It's going to buckle in around D9 and the keystone. Rhythmic articulation in that area, you find the curve and the twist that's there. Rhythmic articulation first into the point of ease within the arch, and then less so into ease in a young baby than you would in an adult, but still you have to do some. Then taking it into the corrective rhythmic movement within that. Go back up and check the vagus and the C2, C1. not there anymore. And that's how you work with rhythm. You find where the strain is, how it's affected, in this particular case, the arch system. In another case, it may be the AP line, and you have to work through the whole AP line, or it may be between the sympathetic and the cerebrospinal at a gross level, so that you're looking at the base, the line between the two trochanters, and how that line coordinates with the tip of the coccyx, with the sympathetics. So it's that understanding that allows you how to approach it, where the key pattern is, and how to introduce the rhythm that it needs to correct it. And again, taking something as simple as the arch process, you don't adjust the abnormal to the normal. You use the normal to overbear the abnormal. So you try and find the norm, what is normal in the rhythm, and try and get it to overbear the abnormal condition. So if there's a broken arch, like that CD arch or central arch in that child, because the DL arch wasn't properly formed, you're still at that age, but it's still to some extent there. So you have to try and reestablish the rhythm within the more functioning side of it, and use then that established rhythm to articulate the dysfunctional side. Does that help at all?
Yeah. Yes, it does. Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
So Stephen's got a question around, can you define normal in the context? Easy question.
Normal doesn't exist. I'm not sure what, you'll have to be a little bit more specific about what.
Okay.
Normal is one of those words that we use all the time. In balance would be better, because most people, what is normal, the norm is what's the mean within the population, which is not what we're looking for. We're trying to find that balance between the internal environment in the patient, the internal gravity fields within the patient, then between the internal field and the external field, the environment. And if the patient has got a lot of disease-forming processes going on in the environment, which he can't deal with, then you have to find a balance that minimizes the effect of that for the patient. I mean, recently we've had people locked up in their homes who are perfectly healthy, who are afraid to go out, and they're trying to pretend that this is okay. The amount of stress that's built up in the patient is enormous. It's a great imbalance between what's going on inside them and their environment outside them and their own personal environment. And to try and get them to get a balance back between that, that's the norm that we're aiming for. Yeah. Is that?
Stephen, does that answer your question on normal? Yeah. Okay. So AG has a question. Why is D9 the keystone?
Why is the world flat? That's the way it's built. It's a keystone in the central arch. It's the pivot between the other two arches, the CD and the DL arch. It is, I mean, sometimes there is no why. The architect that designed the body made it that way. You know, I'm sorry that seems like dodging the question, but it's the truth. Why is the arch in the foot a cantilever spring arch? Because it's designed that way. It's designed to function that way. You know, it's
Can you expand what you mean as a keystone in that context?
Keystone is used in at least two different ways. One, it is the most important vertebra in the arch. And the other is the one that balances the forces of compression and tensile forces in the arch. So if you have an arch like this, keystone would have equal forces on either side of it from the structural point of view. But then you can also get keystones like C2-3, in the structural arch in the neck, being keystone, basically, because Littlejohn said, because it's a gravitational balance point rather than an immediate structural balance point within that arch. So there's two different definitions of it.
Okay. And then you sort of question that, where can you read more about it?
In Littlejohn.
Yeah.
And in Wernham there's a couple of articles on it, and the book that I wrote on it has some stuff on it. And Ben's writing a book on
it. Ben is not writing a book on it, no. Yeah, so there's a book called Spinal Mechanics, which Chris wrote, which has in detail. There's also articles by Wernham. If you go onto the Classical Osteopathy website, you can see some details around mechanics and things there. And that's where I would look to go for more information. Okay.
Chris?
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit more about letting go? Because a couple of people have asked about that.
Letting go. You get the patient on the table. You pick up their arm and it moves, and they move it. My first few treatments from Wernham, you'd pick up my arm, and there it would be, and you'd let go of it. And he'd say, "Why'd you put your arm up there?" I said, "I didn't put it up there, you put it up there." And he said, "No, I didn't put it." We'd have an argument. I couldn't let go. He lifted my arm up and it stayed up there. It should have just dropped. That's me holding on to my control over how my body operates, how my posture is. Posture being how I present myself to the world, not just how I stand. And he had to teach me to let go, let it drop. Oh, I'm holding it. And this is where he says not about not using force or trying to force your way through. He could have moved my arm and wiggled it around and forced his way through it because I wasn't that rigid. But if he did that, I wouldn't learn to let go. I wouldn't learn to accept a new rhythm within the body, the rhythm that he was trying to reimpose for me. So it's a balance between getting the work done and getting the patient to be aware that, oh, hang on, I don't have to hold that tight. I don't have to have my chin like this. Oh, my neck. Why am I holding my neck tight? And that realization that the patient gets from the interaction between the osteopath and themselves on the table, learning to let go. Sometimes we use breathing for it, get them to breathe and let go, to realize that they can actually let go, and to teach them that it's possible. Because some patients are so rigid you can't do anything with them in the beginning. I don't suggest going to what Wernham used to suggest doing. He had a wooden box which he used to say that he ran it down their shin to tell them you let go or else. But I've never seen him doing it. I think he was just trying to emphasize the point that you have to teach them to let go. And if you don't, no real change is going to take place.
Okay. Any? Okay. You've talked about vital force. How do you harness using vital force in treatment? What sort of palpatory experience is it?
It's a difficult one to explain. It's the humility that we have to have when we're treating, that there is an intelligence within the body that it knows better than us how to operate that body, that we're not trying to make it do something. And this is about listening. As an old friend of mine said to me once, that if you're talking, you can't be listening. So in osteopathy, if you're doing, you can't be listening. Some people interpret that meaning that you have to just sit there doing nothing and meditating. That's not the same. You can be still doing while doing that. It's when you pick up a limb and you move it and you feel the rhythm within it. I have no idea how to dance, but I'm told that in dancing, you listen to the rhythm of your partner and you dance with them. You don't tell them how to dance. You don't try and push and pull. It's the same with the body. You pick up and you move it. You feel that rhythm. Where is it stuck? Where is it not? Where is it coming from in the body? And you listen and you follow that through. As Wernham said in the talk, that you can't see the stress lines in the pyramids. You can't see the autonomic rhythms within the body. You can see the result of them in the spine. We've got those visible structures in the body that we can see, but we have to interpret them in terms of the forces that are underneath it. And it's that vital force which governs, that tries to give the body the best health it can for the condition it finds the body in, and how the person's using it and the environment that they're in. And you have to say to the vital force negotiator that, well, there's a better way. If we can get this patient to change their diet, if we can re-establish a baseline underneath them so that they can have a foundation on which to build from, if we can re-establish the cavity pressure so the organs can start functioning and breathing properly and have the drainage that they need and the arterial supply that they need, the vital force can re-establish that base rhythm that it wants. I wandered a bit there, so I'm not sure if that's answered the question or not.
Any other questions at all?
Hi, Chris and Ben. Yeah, so someone was asking about a further explanation of articulation of the body.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be possible to elaborate on that a little bit, please, Chris?
Well, the body is an articulatory mechanism. Everything in it articulates, whether it's the joints, the bony joints, the organs, and as Littlejohn said, right down to the dendritic level. The dendrites articulate with the nerve right beside them to communicate, and everything must articulate properly. So if we are, say, for example, doing an articulation of the third lumbar vertebra with the leg movement, if we change the angle of pressure just a little bit, we can direct that articulation towards the bifurcation of the aorta, or to the great veins, the vena cava, or to the sympathetic ganglia, or to the psoas attachments, and through the psoas attachments to where the lumbar plexus rides in between the two heads of the psoas, and so on. There's a slight change of pressure and angle. We've got all of that field that can be encompassed. And this is where it comes back to that deep understanding of anatomy and physiology that we have to apply it. And the artistry comes from the practice and the working with somebody like Wernham who teaches you. Okay.
Any other questions? Any other questions at all?
Thank you, Chris. So yeah, someone called Tab, I assume that's their initials, has said sometimes it may be useful to use client active approaches like MET or PNF, which is a very similar thing to MET, to get them to participate and then become aware of their holding pattern. Then they're able to let go to a greater extent. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, CORE put MET in the same classification as HVT, as a disruptive technique. The disruptive techniques, they disrupt the neurological pattern that is there. They don't put anything in its place. Now, this is where Littlejohn says, yes, that's correction. Correction then leaves the path open to articulation, which is the real principle of osteopathy. So I'm not sure I would agree with them from that. They can be useful at times, and we do use them. But in terms of teaching the patient, if you're using a HVT, you're disrupting a pattern. If you're using an MET, it's a disruptive technique. in terms of the neurological pattern that's there. Then you have to put something in its place. And that's where the field of articulation, rhythmic articulation, comes in. The Core's paper on that is very well worth reading. Core and Denslow.
Can you remember which paper that was, Chris?
There's just a few of them you can work your way through.
Yeah. There's actually, they are those papers, the Denslow and Core ones, are something that I have quite a lot of interest in, and they are well worth reading, I think.
They are, and they're very much neglected now, but they are. There's a lot in them.
Diego asks, are all cavities in the body approached in the same way? For example, the cranial cavity or the spinal cavity or the visceral cavity?
Yes and no. There's a lovely book by Twentyman. Twentyman was a homeopath, but he gave a lovely description of the cavities of the body, the gross cavities, and saying that one of the mistakes that we make is to use the same approach everywhere. So that you've got the cranial cavity, which he likened to the Pantheon in Rome, a big dome, quiet, contemplative. Got the thoracic cavity, which he likened to a medieval cathedral like Chartres, with the rhythm, general rhythm within it. Then you've got the Baroque cathedral, which he likened to the abdominal cavity. Different approach, different design. And we have to have that difference in our approach. So in the one sense, cavity pressure, yes, but how we work within them is different.
Okay. From Stephen, why do you think osteopaths forget to be vacillatory and apply direct mechanistic techniques such as HVT?
Well, that's the old argument in osteopathy. I mean, it goes right back to the beginning of it. The choice, Simon Simplex, Clem Middleton did a lovely paper on that. What type of osteopath do you want to be? It was done as a cartoon. He said, do you want to be the person with the magic hands? Do you want to be the person seen as the person that heals everybody, or the well-educated person above everybody else? Right to the very beginning of osteopathy, those could do the magic click and get somebody out of pain, or those who wanted to do the hard work and get somebody out of a disease process. Two very different things. The bone setter as opposed to the physician. And then that grew into the arguments between the single treatment and the general treatment. The people that would say, osteopathy only takes 2 minutes of treatment. Others saying, well, don't go to them. They're charging too much for 2 minutes of treatment. Come to us and we'll treat you for an hour. So they would pound them for an hour. This is all to people getting into osteopathy and not understanding the principles involved. And not understanding why they got into osteopathy in the first place. There was also then the argument between those that wanted osteopathy to be seen as a office-based treatment, the specialist that you go to under certain circumstances. There are others that wanted osteopathy to be seen as a full system of medicine. And all of those things got muddled up together. Some people find HVT easy, so they do it, and it looks good and sounds good, and patients are impressed. Littlejohn wouldn't use it. Hall collared him one day and almost forced Littlejohn to show him that he could do it if he wanted to. And Hall was impressed at how easily Littlejohn could do adjustments, do HVT, if he wanted to. But he said it's no use, it doesn't get you anywhere. It's a disruptive single technique. It's like dropping a rock into a pond instead of trying to do something proper with it. It has a place, but it's not the end. That correction only allows you to get into that world of rhythm, and rhythm is where the key is. And a lot of it comes down to teaching. I mean, we've had people working here who come to me and say after about 5 or 6 years, they have no idea what to do next beyond their teaching. They've never seen a patient treated over a period of a year or 2 years regularly. They had no idea how to do it. And you can't blame them for that.
Ask any comments on rhythmic articulation and neuroplasticity, adjustment of person to themselves and environment.
Well, that's what it's about. It's just another set of words on it, yeah, but that's what it's about. We adjust the person to their environment, internal and external. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions? Rob, did you want me to ask that question, or?
Yeah, if that's okay. Well, as I'm talking now, I might as well ask. I know working in where you are, it's quite different to working in the UK in terms of regulation. I was wondering if you're seeing many post-COVID-19 patients, and if there was anything that you've noticed that's specific or about them, or anything you'd like to suggest to us when we start. Well, I'm not started back to work yet, but a lot of other people are. Anything we should be looking for?
That's a difficult question because nobody knows what a post-COVID-19 patient is, or what a COVID-19 patient is either. Yeah, so you're getting in practice, you're getting patients who have been treated with very heavy medical treatment and suppressive treatment. And when that happens, you have to be quite careful that if you treat them too quickly, you're going to reestablish the illness again, because it has to work through its natural process. And then you have to take it through that process. So you need to be cautious. You're dealing with the toxicity of the drug treatment that they've had. Some of them have had a lot of very heavy drugs which they didn't need. They've been put on, some of them have been put on ventilators which they didn't need, so you've got that ventilator pattern to deal with. It's very difficult. Most of the time you're dealing with iatrogenic stuff rather than a disease process. And if you look rationally at the people that have been more seriously affected by the COVID-19, they've almost all fall into the category of patients that have been heavily treated over decades with strong medication of one form or another and repressive illness of one form or another. So it's difficult. And I don't know when somebody is that toxic, when you're going to get that far with them.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a good, very good point.
A lot of fear and a lot of anxiety about it. We have some very old people who are coming here just terrified, absolutely terrified, and that's done more damage than if they had been actually ill with COVID. Much more damage. Their health is deteriorated to such an extent you can't even recognize them. And that's hard to cope with because it's totally avoidable.
Okay.
But it's like any suppressed illness. You treat a suppressed illness, the body will want to try and detoxify. So you need to be cautious of that.
Okay. Any other questions at all? You're about finished.
Okay, well, thank you. And again, my apologies for the quality of the sound on the video from, especially on Wernham's one. Body mechanics is the key to osteopathy. There's no way around it. That's all I can say.
Could you tell us a little bit about your new book? Just
My
to,
new book.
just to wrap up, have you finished
which
that? I
new
know
book?
Ben was supposed to be reading and proofreading it for you last time I heard. How's that coming along?
I don't know. He hasn't got back to me.
Oh, should have words with him.
The final edit is going on next week, so it should be out within the next couple of weeks, hopefully. Yeah.
Okay.
So
thank you.
It's a good book. Should read it. A lot of good history in it. A lot of myths dealt with in it.
Yeah. I found the little precursor book that you gave us really fascinating, because it actually presented Littlejohn's side of the argument, rather than the Kirksville argument that we're normally given, or the Kirksville view that we're normally given.
Well, this one goes a little bit further than that.
Good, that'd be really interesting. I love that kind of history.
It may not make me popular.
Well, it's not a popularity contest, is it?
No, so, it's not.
So. Okay, well, thank you so much for doing this for us, Chris. I know you've had a lot of people in the comments saying thank you. It's been really good, and they've enjoyed it. And thank you, Ben, for doing those Q&As. I'd just like to remind everyone about our new postgraduate diploma in classical osteopathy, and if anyone is interested in looking at that, they should do it. It's a fantastic course and makes people better osteopaths. Have a look at our website at classical-osteopathy.org, and I think that just about wraps it up. So thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and good night.
Thank you.